Thank you so much for that introduction. My name is Cassidy. You can find me at Cassidy on Twitter, on GitHub, on CodePen, all over the place. And I'm here to talk to you about React. And so I'm going to go a little bit into the slides first, and then I'm going to get straight into coding so that way we can talk about it. I'm not sure how many people here have actually used React before. You can let me know in the chat. I'm going to just kind of go from the very, very basics. If you've never touched React before, this is a talk for you. So what is React? React is a declarative library for building user interfaces. And I want to dive into this statement a little bit because I think there's a few key pieces of this. So first of all, in building user interfaces, you're building something that will go onto a web page. You don't necessarily need to build APIs with React, even though you could use APIs with it. You're building just the user interface. Now, the word library, I think, is key as well. The word library is different from the word framework. A lot of people call React a framework, and it's understandable because the words are kind of switched around a lot. But the word library means something that enhances your existing code, your existing JavaScript. React is a library. It's something that adds certain methods and functionality to your JavaScript, but it doesn't really care how you arrange your folders, how you structure everything. It just says, hey, this is what you can do with it. And it's honestly kind of similar to jQuery in that way, where jQuery didn't mind how you organized your applications. It just said, these are the functions you can use, go. And there are definitely frameworks with React, for example, Next.js and Gatsby, but React itself is a library. And the other word I want to dive into is declarative. Now, declarative programming is something that I think is very interesting, but a lot of people don't really understand how declarative programming works or even what it actually is. Now, I have a metaphor for you. Let's just say you're in your car, you're in your house or something, and you want to turn up the AC. You might have a knob like this where you just turn it up like that. And as you get warmer or more cold, you will rearrange the knob so that way you are constantly in a good position. This is how jQuery works. jQuery is something that's imperative. It's something where it will say, okay, if you want to find a certain value on the page, for example, a counter of some kind, you'll get that DOM node for the counter, get the text inside that DOM node, parse it, get the number from it, increase it if you're increasing the count, then apply that to the browser. It's an imperative way of coding. But React is not like this. React is declarative. It's more high tech, kind of like a Tesla or some other thing where you can actually set the number. In something like a Tesla, you set the exact temperature that you want. You're just like, you know what? I know that I'm happiest at 70 degrees. I know I'm happiest at 68 degrees. The car will then decide, okay, we need to make it a little bit cooler or we need to make it a little bit warmer. That's how the car decides you do it. You as the user just say, I just want it to be at 70 degrees. I don't care how you do it, just do it. That's how React is. It doesn't care how you navigate to all the different browser nodes and everything. You as a user, you don't have to do any of that parsing. What you do is you say, hey, I want the state of this application to be like this. And that's it. And then React does all of the browser editing for you. You as a developer don't have to care about it. So that's what's really cool about React. It's a declarative library for building user interfaces. Okay, so now that I've explained that to you, let's actually dive into the code. It was only a few little slides for you, but I'm very excited to show this. Okay, so I'm going to shrink my page over here and pull up a very, very basic React app. And so this is about as basic as it can get. And if you need me to zoom in, let me know in the chat. I'll keep an eye over on the side just to make sure. So whether you're a beginner or you've done it for a while, it's a good way to think about React like this. You can think about React itself as a blueprint, and React DOM uses that blueprint to build user interfaces. React provides all the functionality, all of the functions for making user interfaces, but React DOM actually applies it to the browser. A lot of questions I get often involve, well, can I use React in the browser and the same code base in React Native? Let's see, people are wanting me to zoom in. Happy to zoom in. I will zoom in more. Okay. So React DOM and React Native are different. React stays the same all the time. It is defining those user interfaces, that blueprint. If I wanted to change this to React Native, that means this blueprint will be applied to a mobile interface. React DOM, though, understands what the browser is, what the DOM is, the document object model. And so the DOM is what actually applies it to React DOM. React DOM applies it to the browser. Okay, hope that made sense. Now, as you are actually using React, what you use is React DOM to render your React applications to the browser. And so right here, I have React DOM.render, and it has a simple div right here that says hello, and it says hello over here in the browser. And I'll zoom in on that as well. Okay, so we have hello in the browser because we have this div right here. Now, a lot of times when I show this to people who haven't used React before, they're just like, are you kidding me? You're putting HTML in my JavaScript? Why? And I understand that. I was you once. But what is happening here is this is not HTML. This is JSX. React uses a language called JSX to put things into the browser. And it looks like HTML, but it's actually a templating language. There's actually an equivalent to this. Now, let's just say I wanted to get rid of this whole thing because I just am not a fan of it. I want to turn this into something else. What I can do is, let's just say I'll do let React element is equal to this div right here. I'm going to copy this and put it right here. And so the equivalent of this is just putting React element right in here. If I refresh the page, it looks exactly the same. But if I want to turn this into something that is not using JSX, that's using very plain JavaScript, I can do the exact same thing, but just with plain JavaScript. So instead of having this div right here, I can do react.createElement, and then inside of that function, I can say div. Then the second parameter is just the attributes that we add. We don't have any attributes. And then in here, I could say hello, and I'll add an exclamation point so you can see the difference. If I were now to refresh the page here, it says hello. This is the exact same thing. Having this one line versus this line, they do the exact same thing. And honestly, some people do prefer this syntax. They're just like, I'm comfortable with JavaScript being JavaScript, and that is okay. But what's cool about this too is because it's just JavaScript under the hood, it means that you can get as abstract as you want. And so right now I have a div with the text hello, but I could put a variable in here. And so I could say, let text equals WhatsApp, like this, and get rid of this hello right here. And I'll just put the variable text. And now when I go over to the page and refresh it, we get the WhatsApp. And you can get even more abstract. You could say, instead of this, what I want to do is I want to put an immediately invocable function inside of here. And inside of that function, I'll have an arrow in here, and then it's going to be returning text plus just a bunch of exclamation points like this. And I can do that. And if I refresh the page, what's up? You can do even more and more and more. And it can get disgusting. You can add react.createElements within react.createElements. You can add more and more and more JavaScript, and it'll get gross. Or you could do it with JSX. And so instead of doing this whole nastiness where you start layering all of these react.createElements over and over and over again, what I could do instead is copy that out or comment that out and say, let React element is equal to this div that has the text like this with a bunch of exclamation points like that. Refresh the page. It looks exactly the same. This one line is a lot cleaner than what this is, right? It's just a clean way of writing React elements, and it's a clean way of doing this. And so you can be as weird as you want with React because, again, it's a library. It's not a framework. It doesn't care how you use it. It just says you can do this if you'd like, and you can get really, really weird. I personally don't want to get really, really weird with JavaScript, and so I'm just going to let it be like this. Now, let's just say you want to turn this into a reusable component. There's a difference in vocabulary here that I want to emphasize, and this is something where as you're building React, it's important to understand the difference. There's elements and components. An element is something that you just put on the page and that is it. It's like an expression. But if you want to turn this into a component, let's just say I want this to be a button that's a reusable button that can take in concepts and actually turn into its own tag. There's one thing that you can do. Right now, if I say button, it'll return the exact same thing. If I want to turn this into a button, I do this, and that's it. That turns it into a component because it's a function. A function that returns an element is a component. And that's all it really is. And so I'm going to actually make this a little bit cleaner by doing this and doing return this div. And I'm going to turn this into a button like this, button, button. And then inside of here, I can say button and make it look like an actual component. Now, when I refresh the page, it's a button that says, "What's up?" So that is how you make a reusable component in React. Now, this is great. I could have as many buttons as I want. Let's just say I want to put this inside of its own div in here. I'm going to get this button and I'm going to put in just tons of them like this. Now, if I refresh the page, it's reusable. Look at all these buttons. It's glorious. But I don't want all of them to say, "What's up?" I want them to have some actual functions. This is where the first really big pillar of React comes in, and it's called props. Props is short for properties, and it's similar to HTML attributes, where let's just say I want to do text equals add like this, and then I'll do text equals subtract. If I were to refresh the page with this, it would do nothing. But I can actually access this variable that I pass to this button and use it. And so instead of getting text from the text up here, what I can do is I can say, okay, I have passed props to this function now. And what I can say, let text come from props instead. And so now if I were to refresh the page, I get add and subtract right here, but then because there's no text applied to these two buttons, there's nothing. It's just the exclamation points. And so that's how you actually add values into a different component. I can do add and subtract there. We'll refresh the page. Look at that. We got these two buttons. Now, this is the first pillar. You can pass whatever you want to these. If I wanted to even pass a function, I could say, oh, I want to pass some function where if I click the button, this happens, and then it comes up. That gets really, really powerful. Because if I just said something like on click right in here, and then I'll just have some function in brackets where I'll say, inside of this function, I want to alert, hello, Treehouse, like that. Then what I can do is inside of props, I have text and I also have on click. And then I could say in this button on click, we want to pass in the on click function that we were given. Now, if I were to refresh the page and click it, oh, we've got a naming conflict. That's okay. We can do something. Oh, it's because I only passed it into add. Now we get the pop-up. Hey, it says hello Treehouse. Okay, we can name this anything. I could name it fish, and we can just say this prop is called fish, and it's a function called fish. It'll do the exact same thing, where if I refresh the page and click it, it still says hello Treehouse. It's very flexible that way. Now, this is a very silly example of just alerting some text. It's not that thrilling, but think of it as something a bit more complex. Let's just say you have some important form, and then inside this important form, you have like an on success, and then inside of here, you have some really cool function. This is very powerful if you think about it. Inside this some important form and with this on success, that means you have a user that saw the form, they filled it out completely, they hit the submit button, it sent it off into the ether, and then you got a successful response, a 200 response that came back to you, and now you get to call a function based on that. There's a lot of things living inside of this one component, and that is so, so powerful. And so you can do a lot just with props and components in React. Now, I'd like to add one more element that is the second really big pillar of React. And that second pillar is state. And so there's a function in React called useState where it lets you create what's called a state variable. And with this state variable, you can create pretty much anything. And this is where the declarative nature of React comes to play. So let's just say instead of just buttons, I want to actually make a counter component. And I know a counter component is very simple, but I don't want to run out of time here. So let's just say we have let counter is equal to a function right in here, and that function is going to return components. So we're still making it a component of components. We're going to have this be a div, and then inside of there, we will have our two buttons. I'm actually going to copy our buttons from over here and put it inside of counter. And then I'm going to take this out of render, and I'm just going to render counter right here. In this counter, we have these buttons, and we can pass whatever functions we want to these buttons. And I want to have a variable right here, and we'll call it count. And so I'll do let count is equal to 0. And if I were to refresh the page over here, we have this count 0 and then the add and subtract buttons that do nothing. I'm actually going to add a line break in there just so we can have a little bit more cleanliness. Okay, so we have this count inside of our page. What we want to do is we want to increase the count whenever we hit add and subtract. And so we could make just some quick little functions in here where I could say let add is equal to a function, and then in that function we'll do count plus plus, and then we'll do let subtract. I'll do minus. Typing is so hard sometimes. Sorry for scrolling a bunch. Okay, then with minus we will do count minus minus. And then inside of here we could say fish, because that's what we named it. We could say fish is equal to add and fish is equal to subtract. Or minus, rather. Okay, so now if I refresh the page and I click these, nothing's happening. And this is where the state variable comes in. We're changing a variable, but it's not telling React to re-render that variable on the page. Once this is put onto the page, it's just done. React doesn't care about it. If we want to have a variable that changes, we use that useState hook that I just imported up here. What I can do is I'll say let count equals useState, and then we'll put 0 as this, and now count is suddenly a state variable. And useState actually, it returns a tuple, if haven't used that word in a while, or it returns an array with 2 values. And really it's count sub 0 is the actual variable itself, and count sub 1 is the function that you call to change that variable. And so what you could do, instead of using count, you could say we have the count variable and then the set count function. And so the first variable is the count one that's put on the page, and then set count changes the count. And the initial state of count is 0. So instead of count plus plus, what I'll do is I'll do set count is equal to count plus 1, or count plus plus. Set count is equal to count minus 1, or count minus minus. Now, when I refresh the page, hey, look at that, we have a counter. Oh my gosh, it works. So that's how state variables work. It's something that is declarative, where you say, React, I want this variable to change. I don't care how you render things to the browser. Just when this count variable is here, change it. I'll tell you when to change it by calling this set count function, and I trust you to do all the browser changes that need to happen to make this count variable work. And that's how this counter works. It's relatively simple. And again, it's declarative because we don't care how it's done. We just declare it. We want it to be done. It's kind of like Michael Scott's misunderstanding in The Office when he was just like, I declare bankruptcy. If there were a declarative framework for Michael Scott, that would just work. But unfortunately, he lives in an imperative world. And so by declaring that he is declaring bankruptcy, it doesn't work like that, Michael Scott. You don't live in an imperative framework, in a declarative framework. You live in an imperative one. Okay. I'll do one more quick thing just to kind of illustrate this concept, and then we can get into some questions so I can try to answer them a bit more for you. Now, in a component, you can have as many state variables as you want. And so let's just say inside of our counter, we want to make it so that way it never goes to negative numbers. You can go all the way up, you can go all the way down to 0, but we never want to go below that. So what I could do is I could say, let error equals, and set error equals use state and false. So we are going to have this error variable that is default to false, but then whenever we want to change it, we call set error. What I can do is I can say, hey, if the count is, you know, greater than 1, then we can subtract, but if once it hits 0, we don't want to do that. And so we could say, if count is greater than 0, then we can do this set count. Otherwise, we don't want to do it. And let me put it inside of these brackets here. Okay. So we only want to do this if it's greater than 0. And so if I were to refresh the page, I can add as much as I want, but after this, the subtract button won't work. Now, if you have a user, they might say, hey, I don't like that I'm clicking this button and nothing is happening. It's frustrating to me. And so what we can say is if this count, if we aren't able to click this button, we should set an error or some kind of notice for our users to say, hey, don't worry about it. This button isn't working on purpose. And so what I could say is else, and then we'll do set error is true. And so if error is true, we want to do something with it. And so we can do what's just a Boolean statement in here. So I can do error and then and. This is how you say, if this variable is true, I want to display something. And we can do a div. And then inside of this div, we could say, hey, stop. Or something. That's silly, but we'll go with it. So now I add, I subtract. Now it says, hey, stop if I try to go past that. And I know there's quite a few bootcamp grads in here. You know, if you have a bootcamp teacher, they might have not taught you one of the most important elements in HTML, and that's marquee. So go to your instructors and say, hey, why didn't you teach me this, teacher? I should have learned this marquee tag. It's very, very important. So now when I hit add and then subtract, now you get an animation. By the way, I'm completely joking. This is a deprecated tag that just happens to work in browsers. You probably shouldn't use it, but hey, you can, and that's the power of React. And so you could do some cool stuff with this. Or let's just say I want to put a div inside of here, and I want to turn this this div into having some styles. And so I could do a style inside of here, and then I want to say color is red like this. And so now if I were to refresh it and then go in here, and now it's red. And then I could also have a button in here, and I'll say with this button, I want to have the text is equal to dismiss. And then inside of there, I'll do a fish function, where inside of that, I'll have a little error function in there, and then I'll do set error is false. And so now we can have a dismiss button inside of there. And ooh, actually, let's put it inside our marquee. We're getting chaotic in here now. So we're going to do that. Oops, sorry for scrolling. Don't mean to make you seasick. Hey, that's a fish pun. And so now, if I were to refresh the page, add a bit, subtract a bit. Now it's like a game because you have to catch the dismiss button to be able to make it go away. Wow! Anyway, you can do a lot with React. It's completely declarative. It is something where you can have as many state variables as you want. The state variables tell the browser to re-render different things based on what you tell it. And it's completely flexible because it's just JavaScript under the hood. You can add whatever kind of functions you want. You can add whatever kind of different libraries that you want. And voila, you can even use these really, really old tags that probably shouldn't work in the browser. And it'll just accept it because it's React that just accepts the JavaScript that it gives you. So anyway, that is my introduction to React. I want to thank you so much for listening and for your patience with me as I'm, making jokes that make myself laugh. And I'd love to hear your questions. And so I'll stop sharing my screen here and let's get chatting. Thank you so much. Okay. Oh, there's so many questions. This is so exciting. Okay. So let's see what we have here. Um, is it considered good practice to style elements within React? There are tons of styling libraries within React, and so you can choose whichever one you want. The one that I personally like to use is called CSS modules, which allows you to have a separate CSS file that you could then programmatically apply to different components. There's probably dozens of different CSS and JS libraries that you can use, but I personally like CSS modules a lot. Thank you so much, everybody, for kind words. Nice marquee tags. How strong should the basics of JavaScript be before learning React? I recommend really knowing basic ES6 stuff. So knowing arrow functions really well, knowing the difference between let and const, and really knowing how template literals work and destructuring. If you can hit those points, I think you're set for React. If you need to practice those more, I recommend practicing them a bit more before diving in, because a lot of those are pretty much what happens with React. For example, when you saw me pull out the state variables from useState, that's destructuring. And a lot of the times, if I'm manipulating strings, those are template literals. And a lot of times you might be using let and const to declare your functions and variables. So make sure you know those before you go much deeper into React. What's the speed record on the Rubik's cubes? Just over a minute. I'm not that fast, but fast enough. Let's see, what other questions do we have in here? Let's see. I saw some, but then I lost it in scrolling. Oh boy. Considering React is a JavaScript framework, can you start learning React as soon as you have a grasp on JavaScript? Yes, that's basically what I just answered before. You totally can. It's again something where there are best practices for organizing folders and stuff, but if you just want to get going, what I showed you is the core of React. You can start putting your components in a components folder. You can put functions and utilities that you make into a functions folder, but if you know JavaScript, you can just start working with React for sure. What kinds of projects should you use for React, and what projects shouldn't you? This is a really good question. Um, so you can use React for most applications, to the point where, especially with React Native and React 3, which is a 3D rendering one, and there's also a few game development libraries based on React. You could use React for a lot of different applications. But what I would say is how you apply React is different. So because React is a library, a lot of the stuff that you can do is done in an SPA form or single page application. And when you use these single page applications, it's powerful because you can do a ton without having to make multiple HTML pages or anything. But that can be tough to scale, and that can be tough on search engine optimization. And so I would say for React, if you're starting to have a really large application where, let's just say you want to have an e-commerce application with tons of products and stuff, and you want people to be able to search for your products, you can do all of that with vanilla React. But that is where I would start to recommend using a React framework like Gatsby or like Next.js, where it actually generates the pages for you that are better search engine optimized and that can be serving your users better for scale. React can scale very, very well, but as you start building really, really large applications, that's where you might need to start looking into solutions for how you can make sure you're scaling in the best way for your users. What is your preferred switch for mechanical keyboards? Xylence 67G. Arrow functions, template literals, let const. Oh, what was the first one? Destructuring. Destructuring. Is there an intersection or a collision with React and TypeScript? There is a beautiful intersection. In Create React App, which is like the base React library that you can use if you want to just get up and running, it generates a React application for you. It actually has TypeScript support out of the box. And I think all of the React frameworks have TypeScript support out of the box. It works really well. You can totally do TypeScript and React. Why has React become so popular for user interfaces? Are there competing libraries, or is it the coolest? Coolest, that's definitely not an objective thing to answer, but it's popular because it changed how user interfaces are made for the web. React was the first framework to say, "Hey, this is a declarative way to use the virtual DOM." And I didn't get into the virtual DOM, but really it does a difference engine where it compares what is on the page with a virtual image of the page. Then, kind of like I mentioned, how we don't really care how it works, this is how it works. It does that difference between them, kind of like a Git diff. And it says, okay, because of these changes, these are the changes I have to make in the DOM to apply this to the page. It was the first one to make that concept big and popular, and that has made Vue what it is today. That has even changed how Angular works today. That's changed how even Svelte works. Svelte doesn't actually use a virtual DOM, but it takes a lot of similar concepts. React is popular because it was the first one to do it, and they do it really well, and it's backed by lots and lots of contributors and companies and stuff. And so that is why React is so popular. In terms of, is it the best? Question mark. That is up for debate. I personally love using React, and I think that they've been making really awesome strides. Half of my team are Vue developers who really love working with Vue.js, and they absolutely love it. Some of my teammates, they still are on Angular, and there's tons and tons of cool frameworks coming out for Angular, and they published a new roadmap recently. It's really up to you and what you're comfortable with and what kind of clicks in your brain that you should use. I personally really like React, and once you kind of get those basics up and running, you can do a ton with it. Let's see. I'm coming from old school where jQuery and Prototype were kings. Nice. What are the main differences between jQuery and React? Too many to list, not even comparable? It's kind of like what I was mentioning before. It's imperative versus declarative programming. You can do a lot of similar things, but because React has this virtual DOM that does the declarative stuff for you, where you can say, hey, this is what I want to work, go do it. You can't actually use jQuery with React because jQuery only works with the regular DOM, and React works with this virtual DOM that gets applied to it. I guess technically you could, but it would be kind of weird. Um, the main differences are that React, again, allows you to declare what you want and has a state-driven environment. Meanwhile, jQuery has no environment whatsoever. You basically just say, I want to get this node, I want to apply something to it. I want to do something with the page and apply changes based on this. It's a different kind of library. And so that's really the main differences between them. Let's see. And I think we are at time. Thank you all so much. It's sessions now starting. I want to thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for having me. If you have more questions about React, you can feel free to find me again at Cassidy and go enjoy the sessions and enjoy the rest of your conference. Thank you so much for having me, everybody.